start off this afternoon with a little bit of family history, because so often our engagements with history do start at that starting point, and those family histories lead us on to think about a bigger subject. This is a family photograph of mine, and my grandfather is in this photo, amid many thousands of British Army soldiers stationed in India, in Asia, during the Second World War. He'd be in India until 1947, the year when the Raj splintered into the new states of India and Pakistan. And his name was Godfrey Cordery, and he's this gentleman, the second from the left, with the watch. A very young, blonde and blue-eyed officer recently inducted into the Royal Armoured Corps Officer Training School in Ahmednagar, near Bombay. Now, at first glance, it seems a typical colonial image. The young men in tropical khaki pose in a formal group portrait. And Godfrey, my grandfather, was an unremarkable officer in every way. He didn't see active service. He arrived in 1944 and wasn't able to take part in the battles. But he'd arrived from Buenos Aires. He was an Anglo-Argentinian volunteer who wanted to serve the British Empire. Although he'd never lived in Britain, in common with many millions of colonial subjects, he imagined coming to the Empire's help at a critical hour. Now, bizarrely, there's also a far more well-known person in this photograph. I don't know if you're able to see it clearly enough, or if anybody could spot a familiar face from history. No, good guess. Some of them do look like Monty. Well, in the middle of the front row, this Asian officer here is Zia al-Haq, the future president of Pakistan, sitting cross-legged on the ground. Now, here he was just another young officer at training school, but he became the most powerful man in Pakistan from 1977 until he died mysteriously in a plane crash in 1988. And Zia backed the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan with the covert support of the USA. He's the man blamed by many Pakistanis for dragging Pakistan down an illiberal and religious fundamentalist path. So none of the group here anticipated Zia's rise to dominance. They didn't know that the country Pakistan was even going to come into existence at this time. And my grandfather's path with him crossed momentarily, but I kept this photograph close when I was writing a book about the Raj at war. It reminds me of many things. The imbalance of power between the British and the Indians that still marked the time. You can see the different balance there. The different national and ethnic identities that were being fought out in the 1940s, and the entanglement of my own family with South Asia. And Godfrey's daughter, my mother, married my Pakistani father in London in the 1970s, and that's how I ended up with a different name. So South Asia stood on the threshold of a new era, and many future destinies were being carved out in the fading British Empire. So India in the 1940s was in a tumult of transformation and resistance. South Asia in the 40s was the site of upheaval and cataclysmic change for many millions. The conflicted participation in the war involved an Indian army, more than 2 million strong, standing at the crux of the battle between two empires, the British and the Japanese. The Quit India movement happened, a violent uprising against British control, horrific Bengal Famine, which killed many by starvation and disease, and the pivotal events at the end of empire, the end of British imperial rule in 1947, the decision to partition the region into the two new states of India and Pakistan, and the mass flight of refugees at that time. Britain's part in Second World War and the British imperial part in Second World War are still coming to full historical fruition, and events, archives and concepts are still being fully digested and understood. So there's a massive publishing industry in Britain around the Second World War. I think recently in 1 year there were 300 books on the Third Reich published in the UK. But nationalism and the nation state are still often the framework. And knowledge of imperial involvement is still sort of only slowly coming to light in the sense of the role of black and Asian soldiers, for instance. And we've heard much of that around the First World War more recently. And in India too, it's been the national framework which has determined memory of events, particularly the memorialisation of the Quit India movement of 1942 and the partition of 1947. Now I've just completed this book, which is where the sweeping title of this talk originates, this book, The Raj of War, at War. And in the book I've tried to tell the story of this history of the 1940s in Asia through many different voices, through Indian, British and other nationalities too, who experienced the war in various and often contrasting ways, trying to reflect the diversity of wartime experience in India. Merchants, industrialists, merchant seamen, agriculturalists, as well as soldiers on coastal waterways or in mountains, who all had their own ways of negotiating the challenges and opportunities of war. And so the book tries to give a flavour of these plural and often hidden voices. Now, rather than reprise the whole book in 45 minutes, which I thought I'd sort of discuss some of the choices that I had to make in writing the book, in the process of writing the book, and some of what it covers. And then focus on a few of those individuals, 5 of those individuals who emerge in the narrative, and how their stories reflect the multiple vantage points of that wartime. And so I'll look at a British Indian civil service officer, a British civil officer, 2 soldiers, 1 Indian sepoy and 1 British officer, and a woman who was a well-known participant in the Quit India movement, and if we have time also at an Indian industrialist. So how should we write a book about the Second World War in India? Who should be the subjects of such a book? And what should it focus on? Now, the soldiers, of course, are really often the starting point. There were 30 Victoria Crosses awarded during the Second World War to Indian soldiers, and this is a soldier here receiving his medal from Auchinleck. Everyone's heard of the Gurkhas, and many people have heard something of the role of Indian soldiers at major battles like Tobruk, Monte Cassino, Komar and Imphal. The 14th Army, a multinational force of British, Indian and African units, turned the tide in Asia by recapturing Burma for their allies. And it was also, of course, the role of nurses and people further back on the supply line who helped to keep that going. And here you can see a nurse on a hospital train, these trains which would nurse people and treat people as they came back from the battlefronts, and treating an Indian soldier there. But it's also a complicated story, and one where there's coercion and differentials of power. For instance, young boys as young as 14 and 15 enlisting, or young men enlisting as a way to put bread on the tables of their families. And here you can see at the bottom a long line of Indian soldiers lined up, or would-be Indian soldiers, for the recruitment officer who's having a look and selecting, looking at their health and fitness. So who do we write about? Is it just a military story, or what about beyond the fighting fronts, beyond those battle scenes? What about all the other people who were caught up in the war? Numerous other South Asian people sweated behind the scenes to secure supply lines and to support the Allies. Non-combatants, like cooks, tailors, mechanics and washermen, such as a boot maker to the Indian Army named simply as Gaffer, who died at the Battle of Keren in present-day Eritrea, and whose grave can still be seen there today. We don't know very much about the women who mined coal for wartime in Bihar and central India, or the gangs of plantation labourers from southern India who travelled up to the mountains of the northeast to hack out roads there. And these are some women working, these are propaganda photographs, and one of the things researching this book, which was amazing, is the wonderful photographs which are available of wartime activity in Asia, because they were being used at the time as propaganda photographs. And so there's some women there working in textile factories, producing uniforms and parachutes and such goods that were shipped out across the Empire Commonwealth, and down the bottom, munitions factory, munitions supply. So it wasn't very glamorous work often, loading and unloading cargo at imperial ports or clearing land for aerodromes. But it could be very dangerous, and many labourers died building treacherous roads, including the Lado Road between China and India, working with basic pickaxes and prey to malaria and other tropical diseases. And I think it's another wonderful photograph. I like this very much, of women workers carrying grit and rocks across the aerodrome, across the airfield space, where they're helping to build these many air bases which were across Asia to serve both the British RAF and the American Air Force. Now, part of this story, sadly, is this terrible Bengal famine, which we have to factor into the history of the 1940s. There's no way of not making this a central part of that history. But compared to the partition, strangely, it's far less well known and understood. And I think we see often documentaries about partition now on television, but the Bengal famine is still, I think, a less well understood and less well circulated story, but it does deserve integration with civilian deaths in global histories, like Hiroshima and the Holocaust, I think. And something like 1.5 to 3 million people died during that famine. We don't know exactly how many people died. The majority of the deaths were from disease caused in the context of food shortages and death rather than starvation, but there were starvation deaths too. So who are the subjects of a history of the Indian Second World War? Do we write about these people who are affected by famine too? And is it just an Indian story, or is it an Asian story, or is it a British story? Who do we include? And this is a picture of African regiments who played a very important part in Burma in the battles in Koma and Imphal. They were sent from East African and West African regiments. And one of the things which was really surprising to me when writing this book and researching the book was just what an international story India in the 1940s is. You have American troops coming over, Polish refugees in flight from Europe, refugees from across the world converging on India as a place of safe haven initially before the Japanese attack. And so and international soldiers as well. So this great sort of mingling and mixing and diversity of people that's taking place. Just to give you, some of you will be much more familiar with it than others, I'm sure, but just to give you a few key dates, just so we know roughly what we're talking about. 1939, India entered the war. The controversy from a political point of view was that India was entered into the war by the British government, by the Indian government in India, which was British, without the consultation of the key political leaders of the day, Gandhi, Nehru, and the Indian National Congress. And because they hadn't agreed to it, that's where the real political conflict kind of emerged throughout the 1940s. In 1942, the war really comes to India's shores because the Japanese very rapidly and somewhat unexpectedly sweep across Southeast Asia and take Singapore clearly, and then up into Burma. And through that, there is a moment, a very wobbly moment, when people really feel that India might be invaded or might fall to the Japanese. And there's a moment at which refugees are kind of moving inland from coastal parts of India because they're scared about potential Japanese bombing. There are air raids on India, and there are sort of sighters. Japanese carriers are seen off the coast of India, and there's this moment in early 1942 when there is that anxiety about that, and it's just after that this protest movement is launched against the British rule in India, the Quit India movement, in response to the Congress leaders, the high command of the Congress, including Gandhi, including Nehru, having been jailed. So that's in 1942. So 1942 is a very pivotal year. In 1943, the key event is the Bengal Famine, which I've mentioned, which happens in that year, and we can have more discussion about that if there's time at the end, if anybody wants to ask questions about the famine. In 1944, you get the sort of fight back against the Japanese in Southeast Asia with the battles of Kohima and Imphal, and this push back, the defeated forces that have been pushed out of those parts of Southeast Asia, out of the empire there, kind of rolling back, pushing back against that, and trying to push the Japanese back in that space. And in 1945, the war ends, and those Congress leaders I talked about are finally released. They've been in prison throughout those years. Gandhi's really slightly earlier because of ill health, but the others, the high command of the Indian National Congress, are kept in prison. And then in 1947, just 2 years later, you have partition and the independence of India, and the creation of these new nation states of Pakistan, India, East and West Pakistan, and India. So that's just to sort of set up the chronological framework for what I'll go on to talk about now. So I'm going to take these 5 individuals in turn and just think of them as potted life stories, or potted stories as ways of thinking through the diversity of experience during the Second World War and the different ways that people encountered the 1940s and encountered the war in their different lives, from depending on where they were and their different roles that they had to play in the 1940s. This is in New Delhi, the complex from which the Viceroy governed India, which was actually, strangely, only really sort of fit for habitation by the end of the 1930s. So my first subject is an Indian civil servant named Ian Hay MacDonald. I don't have a photo of him, unfortunately. By 1939, 12,000 posts in the Indian civil service, 540 were held by Indians, with the remaining 700 or so held by British. Now, MacDonald was one of them. Maintaining a European presence in the Indian civil service became a struggle for the Indian government during the war, and ICS recruitment in Britain eventually ceased completely in 1943. So that's the steel frame of empire, the civil servants who are running the Indian Empire is sort of almost run 50-50 by Indians and Brits by the 1940s. MacDonald was a Scot from a middle-class household in Edinburgh and was concerned with money and with his career. He'd joined the ICS as a career civil servant after graduating from Oxford. He struggled with language learning, was a bit homesick and lonely, at times even a bit depressed, a situation which was exacerbated by the fact that he was single. MacDonald was one of the last generation of the ICS recruits in the late 1930s, and he was given the province of Orissa in western India, which bordered onto Bengal. And that's also the coastline where the Japanese would be launching air attacks after their capture of Singapore in 1942. So he's not on the front line of war, but MacDonald gives us, mainly through letters home to his parents, and I've sifted through hundreds of letters that he wrote home, the viewpoint of an ICS man at the grassroots watching the World War as the constant backdrop to his work and career, without directly encountering any of the most violent upheavals of Burma or further north. Now, one of the things which is striking about MacDonald is he's very young, but he has so much power and responsibility. I mean, he had almost personal fiat over very large territory. In September 1942, he wrote home, "This is the largest district in India, 12,000 square miles, I think, of which I am now lord of 4,000. And like in common with many other administrators at the time, he arrived in India in 1938. He was made a collector by 1943, which is one of the highest ranks in the Indian civil service. And he had this rapid promotion, but very vast responsibilities. He had to deal with famine in his district. So this was characteristic of wartime and post-war promotion within the ICS. There were some meteoric rises because of the growth and because of the demand of new roles of wartime. And he looked on with some disbelief as the war unfolded in Europe, and as he learnt of his brother's enlistment in the Royal Navy at Portsmouth and of bombers sighted over his family home in Scotland. Within a year, several of his university classmates would be dead. Later in the war, he described watching it as if it was a show, like being in a grandstand watching some game or other. We're so cut off from it here. As in Singapore, Hong Kong, and other great Eastern imperial cities, the war was impinging on life in random, occasional ways at first, without causing any real sort of restructuring of his career or of his daily demands on his work. This brought guilt, but also a sense of relief. He said, "You certainly wouldn't think there was a war on if you saw us here. We get as much butter and bacon as we want, and there's no shortage of British goods, all sent out presumably to keep up the export trade. I must say I've had bad attacks of conscience at the life we lead." He was able to hear the news through the BBC, but also through Access broadcasts, and he said that the BBC compared very unfavourably with the German wireless, both in terms of reception and quality. The German stuff is much more musical, bright, and chatty, he reported. But through his career, slowly, we can see the unfolding pressures of war work. So he becomes an air raid precaution worker. Once he's collector, he's also responsible for ARP control along the whole of that western coastline. And as in Britain, in India, air raid precaution workers patrolled the streets, looking for light seeping out from between drawn curtains, and offering first aid and warning sirens in the event of the dreaded attack. The coloured lights of religious festivals were identified as a potential target, and worshippers were told to extinguish their lights. A handful of elite administrators dug and installed Anderson shelters in their bungalows, but for the population at large, such shelter was never a possibility. The Secretary of State for India was asked about this in the House of Commons, and he said it was a physical impossibility to construct deep shelters to give protection from bombs. So there was a real fear of loss of life in India in 1942. Now, for Ian MacDonald, air raid precautions now absorbed much time and money, particularly in the cities. By the end of the year, there was many complaints coming because of the sort of lack of willing participation by people in the air raid precaution scheme, and air raid precaution workers were having to be paid to come out onto the streets. But people also sort of justly complained, I think, about the fact that the pits and the kind of shared communal shelters were often stinking, filled with rubbish, and these pits had little appeal to factory workers who were ordered to stay in them during air raid warning signals but were unable to join their families or bring them into the shelters. The elusive but significant feeling of a war not properly understood or appreciated troubled imperial administrators like MacDonald through the 1940s in India. But accompanying this was the attempt to emulate tried and tested methods from the British home front. I retain an uneasy feeling that our system is too much an attempt to copy methods which have proved effective in blitzed British cities, but that with the material at our disposal and our conditions, we want something rather different, he wrote home. He said to his parents, it's all based on British experience. Many think that a far better model would be the Chinese cities which have been bombed, as they're much more like Indian towns. Now, through this experience, MacDonald's politics became more and more anti-Indian National Congress, and he described himself as a diehard on the political question. His views would probably have been viewed quite favourably by Churchill. The Indian race must be, I think, the most contemptible on earth, at least the bits I've seen of it, he wrote home. For instance, he thought Indian soldiers were getting too much credit for their role in the battles, when they were unable to organise, when Indians generally were unable to organise a Sunday school picnic. This is his words. But he did encounter other local people, and one unusual set of Europeans that he spent some time with were the local German Lutheran missionaries before they were interned, because Germans in India were interned as well in the 1940s. So he had a New Year's Day party with some of the German missionaries and sampled German cakes and other foods, and even commented when his friend's child was baptised, it had to be done by a German missionary who read out the Church of England service. So I think through MacDonald's career in the 40s, you can see that detachment and difficulty of trying to manage the empire, but from a sort of peripheral position during the war, and his great frustrations that the ICS weren't allowed to join the army, and his great frustrations and irritation at being left out of an event that so many of his contemporaries were so fully involved in. And at the end, he wrote home to his mother and father, most of my inside knowledge of what has happened in the war comes from stray conversations with people who seem to have come from all parts of the world and have seen and done everything, while we have been buried alive in India, rather a lost generation, in fact. Now, I move on to my second subject, who's somebody completely different, but also a British person in India during the 1940s. This is a soldier whose name is Clive Branson, and he wrote letters home too, but these were collected and published in a booklet, which you can see here, called British Soldier in India. And there's a photograph there in that oval of Clive Branson. And he was also a poet and an artist. And one of his paintings is in the Tate. This is a painting that is which he made whilst he was in London, of the Blitz in London, of a plane flying into a London street. And Branson served in India from 1942. His published letters during wartime became popular, and he'd been before that in Spain with the International Brigade. He was killed fighting the Japanese on the Burma front in 1944. And he was both anti-fascist, extremely anti-fascist, wanted to play a part in defeating both the Germans and the Japanese, but also anti-imperialist to his marrow. His letters home are extremely moving precisely for this attention to small details and for his careful observations of the imperial system in India. He writes with great insight and passion about seeing women rock breakers with their small children in tow building aerodromes like the ones we saw earlier in that photograph. And he describes the problems and worries of the British men serving with him and the way that one man, for instance, slaps an Indian soldier and the arguments that ensue after that in the mess. He traces the growing food shortages and emerging famine with mounting despair and horror. And even on the brink of battle on the border with Burma, very soon before he dies, in one of his last letters, Branson mentions how local cultivators have had their land affected by the battlegrounds and crop growing being disrupted by the preparations for battle. And he goes into market towns, he tries to learn Hindi, he's often sort of meeting all sorts of people at cafes and bookstores, and all the time while he's serving as a soldier in India, he's also discussing in India's development, India's politics. So his reaction to that uprising that I mentioned in 1942, to the Quit India movement, is very interesting, it's very revealing, because it was put a lot of soldiers in a very tricky spot, because they were being used as an aid to the civil power during the war. And there were these tensions of being pro-war, but being kind of uncomfortable, being used to put down a civil uprising within India. So he wrote home, "Today things have gone so far that pacifism is impossible. One cannot foretell what will happen. The movement is so far confined to the towns, mainly angry demonstrations against police stations with a little shop breaking, telephone wire cutting, shop closing, etc. Although one doesn't agree with what the people are doing, one understands why they do it." So Branson was the most prominent of a group of people to express such feelings in print, but others felt deeply sort of ambiguous and ambivalent about this position in the 1940s. Clive Branson, who'd left a wife and a young daughter behind in London, was also sensitive to this gender implications, the implications for women of the 1940s, and especially the way that many of the men in the army were going to brothels. And he commented on a visit by the men of his company to a brothel under official patronage, and on the well-known fact that the men were going into cheap brothels. Now, this was a theme that was beginning to exercise people across the political spectrum, from military commanders who were very worried about the impact on men's health, to local politicians, Indian politicians, who were making the most of this fact to sort of demonise and implicate the imperialists. So across the political spectrum, there are people who are getting very worked up about this. It was a shock for British servicemen to see the slums of Bombay or the poor on the streets, and they had to make sense of the British imperial civilising mission anew. A mutual undercurrent of apprehension marked many initial transactions with shopkeepers. School textbooks had taught many British youth about the benefits of imperial rule for India, but now many became uncertain about this when faced with the evidence before their own eyes. And this particularly becomes a problem during the famine. In Bengal, soldiers waiting for action in Burma now found themselves on the front line of a different sort of calamity. They witnessed shocking deaths, and Clive Branson was really sort of raging at the famine. He wrote home, "The ordinary decent people in England must do something. This is their empire. I have no doubts about our beating the Japanese in spite of the state of India, but what fills me with horror is the post-war payment we'll have to make." And it's all very well to parade members of the 4th Indian Division around England, but the sincerity of that praise wears a bit thin if these men's relatives are dying of hunger in the villages of Bengal. So there were others who wrote similarly. John Saville, who was another soldier, later became an academic, read Branson's letters on his way out to India and similarly grappled with these questions. These men had an eye for injustice, whether racial or class-based, and wherever they encountered it, and they managed to sort of straddle this position of being anti-imperialist and anti-fascist. Now this is somebody completely different, a woman and an underground activist called Aruna Asif Ali, and she's not one of the women activists in this kind of group here of 3 women, but I've included that picture here because it's part of a demonstration in which she took part in. Now, Aruna Asif Ali was very much in the shadow of her husband in 1940. Like many middle-class and elite women in the politics of the 1940s, she was becoming more active in social work. And just before the war started, she celebrated her 30th birthday. She lived in Old Delhi in a typical old haveli tucked in the walled city. And at first appearances, she seemed like a courtly lady. She spoke impeccable English and Urdu. She could converse about art and poetry. Shaw and Ibsen were among her favourites. And she dressed in tasteful saris, and she was sort of well known as this hostess around the town. But she'd actually been born from more humble origins in a railway town where her father ran a sort of canteen. Convent educated and strong-willed from an early age, Aruna had left home to work as a teacher. Before long, she met an unsuitable man and married him. Aruna's husband, Asif Ali, was 23 years older than her. He was a Muslim, and he was in the innermost circle of the Indian National Congress. Now, like many people in the 1940s, Aruna became kind of caught up in the intensity of political feeling that was sweeping India, and she was coming round to the idea that more radical, revolutionary steps should be taken in the anti-imperial campaign. So this was a break with Gandhi and those tactics of non-violence that had dominated the anti-imperial movement up until then. This was a generational division, with young people rallying to radical politicians, and this divide had started to make a rift in the Ali's own household, with Asif Ali, her husband, being far more circumspect and cautious about the idea of launching a protest against the British Raj. But Aruna was becoming more and more committed. With every rejection of Indian advice and opinion by Britain, she later recalled, anger and resentment against imperialism blazed as never before. Many men and women of the then younger generation were angry with the elder leader's hesitation to embarrass the British government. Now, Asif Ali was much more cautious and introspective, and he was the more well-known and prominent leader. So when those arrests, that wave of arrests happened in 1942, it's Asif Ali, it's her husband, who was arrested, and Aruna's name was left off the list. And so through the 1940s, through their letters and diaries, we can see playing out the different experiences of the two. Aruna, meanwhile, stayed on the outside, and she was sort of dragged into a protest. She saw, she went to a demonstration in Bombay, and she saw police violence against protesters, and she saw gas attacks and lathi charges with sticks. And so at a public square, she found herself propelled forward to leadership. She raised the Congress flag, and she started heading a procession. And after that day, she went underground. So she decided to go underground and help organise this Quit India movement from underground. So the plan was for a number of leading politicians and wives and middle-class activists who hadn't been jailed to work as saboteurs and agents provocateurs against the colonial state. First, Aruna went to Delhi. She couldn't go back to her house, and so she moved around and lived in the homes of people. The government offered a 5,000 rupee reward for her capture. And for the next 4 years, Aruna was on the run, resisting calls to come out of hiding, all the time while her husband was in prison. And Asif Ali, her husband, meanwhile, is absolutely terrified that she might be getting involved in violence, is extremely anxious and worried about what she's up to, and is very strongly kind of opposed, in a way, to the way that the Quit India movement is going. But Aruna resists calls to call off this activity. Even when Gandhi himself asks her to stop it, she carries on. And when she does finally come out of hiding in 1946, when the arrest warrant against her is cancelled, her marriage hasn't survived. Asif Ali and her, there's a parting of the ways. He goes off to be the first ambassador to independent India. And Aruna Asif Ali became a very prominent and well-known Indian politician, but sort of within the Indian National Congress party. So their story and the story of their different experiences during the 1940s in a way sort of encapsulates the different ways of reacting to the Raj and the different ways that different Indians were kind of grappling with the right thing to do, what the right thing to do was in the 1940s. My fourth character is an Indian sepoy, a soldier, junior soldier, called Budgin Singh. So we're moving further eastwards now into the Indian Ocean to the Andaman Islands. The Andaman Islands is a small string of islands just between the eastern coast of India and Thailand. And that was the only territory captured by the Japanese, Indian territory captured by the Japanese in the Second World War. The Andaman Islands were occupied. But the Andamans were also the site of a jail, a famous prison which was maintained by by the British from the 19th century onwards as a place, as the sort of maximum high security prison to put both civil and military prisoners and political prisoners. So by the close of 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was widely known in Delhi that it would be almost impossible to hold the Andamans from the Japanese, and an evacuation plan was put in train. The evacuation of women and children was made a priority, but then also the convicts, and it was decided that the convicts in the prison should be shipped back to mainland India to stop them from falling into the hands of the Japanese. Over the following weeks throughout January and February, ships slowly made the return journey from the Andamans to Calcutta, taking with them British and Indian officers, their families and more junior officials. But what to do with the prisoners on the island, shackled and kept on the lower decks? Many of the prisoners were also evacuated back to mainland India, as the government feared that there'd be a gift for the Japanese if and when the invasion took place. Ultimately, most of them were taken back and moved on to jails in central India. Now, the prospect of these prisoners being shunted from dockside to police van or being spotted by a passerby was very worrying to the state, so it was kept secret, and a coded telegram was used to instruct the government to move these secret prisoners. And the Japanese, they were right to move them because the Japanese then captured the Andamans in March 1942. Now, in the early 1942, 24-year-old Budgin Singh was one of those top secret security prisoners sent back to mainland India from the cellular jail. But he wasn't just a prisoner, he was also a former soldier, a sepoy of the Central India Horse, recruited from a typical Sikh agricultural tract in Punjab. Among the prisoners on the Andamans who had been convicted for civil crimes like murder lived these military prisoners, described by one official as lost sheep, convicted by court-martial and sentenced to transportation. Now, he'd been convicted for 10 years. He'd been sentenced to imprisonment for 10 years, and he was heavy with regret. And we know this because I found his mercy petition, which he's dictated and has been placed in the National Archives in India. And you can see he was illiterate because he just marked it with a blue thumbprint. You can see his mercy petition, but that's what I'm drawing on here. So he dreamed of reprieve and also of being allowed to rejoin military service. He was remorseful, lamenting his crime as the foolish act of a young man. He said he'd failed to carry out orders when stationed in July in 1940 and partially under the influence of liquor, and he had no idea that it amounted to mutiny. And he also regretted having joined bad company, thus being led astray. So guards bundled Budgin Singh and his fellow prisoners into vans on arrival in Calcutta's port, and they were taken to the Presidency jail while train arrangements were made. They'd been in transit for about a month, and the central provinces must still have felt a long way from Budgin Singh's home village in Punjab, in Amritsar, further north, although I think he was probably relieved to be back in mainland India. But there was still little prospect of any family visit. On hearing of his delinquencies, his father, Butta Singh, in all likelihood a former soldier himself, had disowned him. Budgin Singh's mercy petition, written from Nagpur Central Jail, conveys the angst of the young soldier, who, he said, came from a thoroughly loyalist family and feels thoroughly ashamed of himself. To further reassure the Crown of their loyalty, his father had immediately, on hearing the bad news, had his younger son and nephew enlisted for active service in the Second World War. So this was a family with long-standing ties to the Indian Army that had rendered loyal military service during the Great War. Singh's great hope was that at a time of expanding recruitment and war overseas, he could implore his way to freedom. His conduct in jail had been good, and he continued in his petition that should pardon be extended, he would immediately proceed on active service anywhere out of India and be loyal to the Crown forever after. Your petitioner feels that he could be of better use in this world by fighting for the cause of freedom and is prepared to die for his king. Budgin Singh's timing was fortunate. Both the fall of the Andamans to the Japanese and the growing need for armed men, for trained young men in the military, worked in his favour, and he was recommended for release by the jail board. So military prisoners added the strain to civil jails, which were already struggling under the weight of arrest for the civil disobedience movement. Let's go. My final character is another Indian from very different location and place, Walchand Hirchand, who the Walchand group still exists in India today. It's still a very, very big business. But in the 1940s, Walchand was one of the wealthiest men in India. clean-shaven, wearing a turban and spectacles. This is a post-independence postage stamp with his face on. He was a very talkative and energetic businessman. And Volchan's great passion was building ships, but also all kinds of transportation. And during the 1940s, he wants to build the first Indian steamship. So we first meet him in the southern port city of Vizag in 1940, darting around the city with a team of American, British, and Indian advisors in tow, talking to local engineers, local politicians, interviewing local merchants and suppliers. He was a shrewd businessman. He was the owner of the fourth largest company in India at the start of the war, which he'd personally built up from scratch. And he knew that there were plenty of opportunities now to make money. So he already had a passenger shipping business, and this was being used for troop movements and for cargo. But as he toured Vizag, he started to dream of great steel and iron constructions that would arise in the shipyards. India needed aeroplanes, cars, machineries, and ships. And indeed, the ability to sail commodities across the globe, either around the Cape or through the Suez Canal, had never been more dangerous or more necessary. And Volchan is just a sort of bundle of energy through the 1940s. This is him in America at the Tennessee Valley Authority, talking to people there about fertilizers and how you might improve productivity, agricultural productivity. He goes into aircraft production halfway through the war, gets American investment from the government of India, and ultimately he produces the first Indian-built fighter planes and also the first Indian-built steamship, which he manages to build at the end of the war. But the reaction of industrialists like Volchand is also interesting, because secretly he's bankrolling those Quit India activists, like Aruna, who I showed earlier. The cause for which Aruna was on the run, he's siphoning off money, and it wasn't just Volchand. Many others, G.D. Burla and G.L. Mehta and other big Indian industrialists, were sort of hedging their bets through the 1940s, making major profits through the war, but also bankrolling the underground rebels and very clearly aligning themselves with the nationalists, because they knew that at independence that was going to be the ruling power. And so, although their businesses boomed during the 1940s, Volchand was able to start an airline, help construct the first Indian-built bombers, and build the first Indian-built steamship. He also complained very much about requisitioning, about the use of Indian materials by the war effort, and by what he felt was preferential contracting to the wartime state to British companies. And also the loss of stock and plants, and that, he said, was his pretext for backing the nationalists, who now were evidently going to take power at the end of the war. So just to try and sort of bring some of these different strands together, and these multiple different characters that we've heard about this afternoon, I think the Second World War in India is a bundle of paradoxes, and it turns into a site of many different things simultaneously. It's a barrack for hundreds of thousands of soldiers of different nationalities based there, Indians and British, but also American, Chinese, Australian, African. It's also a site of refuge for refugees and those fleeing from more ferocious sites of war, even Poles and Burmese and Indians from Southeast Asia. Even British schoolchildren sent out as evacuees because their families felt that India might be a safer place than Britain. It also became a training ground and munitions plant. India's cities swelled as labourers flocked towards inflated wartime wages and subsidised food and factory work. It was a rest and recreation ground for soldiers who wanted to let off steam and relax. But it was also a site of resistance and tenacious rejection of the war, with the Congress leaders in prison from 1942 and their refusal to accept the war's aims and methods. And also massive political dislocation in India as a result, as people drilled and joined militia groups and increasingly supported alternative forms of political aspiration, most notably the Muslim League and the rise of the Muslim League in the 1940s. So this sense of paradox and contradiction is essential in the sense that the war isn't a simple or a moral tale, and the wisdom of fighting the Japanese looked different depending on your vantage point, survival strategies, and access to resources in the 1940s. Although never comparable to fascist regimes, and I think the mistake of some of the nationalists is to think that it might be, the British imperial regime was nonetheless coercing individuals into military roles did play a part in food deprivation and exploiting India as a supply base for the war. So the diversity of individual experiences is one way to understand the interlocking of imperial strategies with wartime strategies, bringing into the same frame two different times in the history of the 1940s, which are often seen as separate things. I think as if the empire was in black and white and the war occurred in colour. I'll be happy to take questions for the next sort of 10, 15 minutes or so. Yeah, gentleman at the back there.
Just out of sheer interest, how do you think India would have developed if the British had failed to gain a foothold in India and the Raj itself hadn't occurred?
Well, I mean, as a historian, one of the things that you wonder about, as a research student, is counterfactuals, because we're not placed as historians to deal with counterfactuals.
Came very close to being bankrupt. He was bailed out by the British government. If they chose not to bail him out at that moment in time.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, because we don't know, and I mean the whole history of the world would have been different potentially. But at the same time, it's very hard to say, because it's a counterfactual, and we kind of are left with, as historians, the stuff of the past is what we have to kind of work with, rather than what it might have been. But it is it is a question of contingency and chance, and you just think it is amazing that kind of company taking a foothold at that point makes such transformation to the global history. Yeah. And gentleman there.
I gather that India was a very significant supplier of arms and ammunition as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any feel for what proportion of the total amount they supplied during the war?
I can't give you a percentage figure, but I certainly know that there were numerous munitions factories all over the subcontinent, and they were making all kinds of arms. And I know somebody at the moment who's working on a book about gun production in the 1940s in India, because there was a lot of the guns were being made in India, but I don't know a percentage.
Are we talking about a third or something like that?
Possibly, yeah, very, 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 very possibly. I mean, there were certain goods and items where well over half were coming from India. I mean, for instance, parachutes. I mean, there were just sort of millions of parachutes coming out of India. Uniforms, a lot of the textiles, a lot of boots, all sorts of things were coming out of India. But I don't know percentage for arms. But you're certainly right. I mean, there were munitions, big and small kind of things being made, and also sort of strange things, like there was like sites for. You'd have sort of small workshops where people would be making sites for aircraft and things like that. Components and parts, not necessarily the whole finished product. So.
All these things transported around the Cape rather than being used in Asia.
Yes, some of them were being transported, and some of them were being used in Asia. So obviously it shifts after 1942. There's a moment where it changes, because then it's being more sort of directed towards Asia. But before that, they're being brought around the Cape, and that's why shipping becomes so essential and so important, because you're really relying on those ships being able to get through to be able to take some of these goods around. Lady here.
What was the cause of Bengal famine? Or
Wow.
was it
Yeah.
lots of things?
It is lots of things. I mean, it comes under the umbrella of the war, because this issue of shipping and not being able to transport food stocks around, and the capture of Burma by the Japanese. And Burma's been a place where lots of rice has been exported to India in the past, up until that point. So, the wider context of the war is what happens. But there's a lot of debate about if it could have been avoided, there is a cyclone. There's a major cyclone, bad weather, but also management and on the ground, and is there enough food? The big argument, there's a Nobel Prize winner at Cambridge called Amartya Sen. Some of you may have come across it. He was very instrumental in making an argument about the fact that there had been enough food there, but it was badly distributed, that people were stockpiling or hoarding it. And others have said, no, that's not true, there just wasn't enough food. So there's a lot of different arguments about who should have done things differently and where responsibility lies. But ultimately, it does come down to the framework of the war. I mean, one thing that we certainly do know, which is a really grim but very well documented story, is that when relief supplies were demanded and when rice was needed, once the famine was clear and we knew that the famine was happening, the the kind of requests for more supplies from Britain or from Europe were being turned down or cut back or slashed. So the relief effort was pretty dire on the British side. Go back.
What sort of resources are you able to draw on? I mean, particularly for Indian and possibly even African soldiers, are there memorials? Are there sort of memoirs at all levels? Are there? Is it letters you're using?
Yeah, sources. It's a real discrepancy because you can sort of go on the bus or the train down to the British Library and there's hundreds of officers' accounts, and Indian officers too, but mainly sort of British officers or American officers. But to kind of find the account of the sort of Indian sepoy, for instance, is very, very hard, and particularly now because people are so elderly, they were often, really just joining at the tail end of the war, and I did do some interviews, but mainly with officers. And it's hard. You have several layers of difficulty in getting to the kind of really raw recruit who's come from a village somewhere. So some of the sources were things in files and in paper files. So for instance, that Mercy petition is very interesting because it gives you an insight into something that's happening at the time, that's in an archive. So there are different ways of tracing it, but it's certainly much harder to get to the voice of the subaltern.
Do we know if he survived? Or
No.
if he went to a fight outside India?
I don't know. I should perhaps kind of go back and see his number and try and trace the story all the way through and find out what happened to him. That'd be interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you tell us something about the treatment of the Congress members detained?
Yeah.
Were they as common offenders or were they given special privileges?
Oh, they were treated very well. I mean, their main complaint was that they didn't get access to news or to other people. They couldn't meet other people very easily. So the main kind of Congress leaders, Nehru, who becomes the first Prime Minister of India, and his kind of key friends and leaders were in an old fortress called Ahmednagar, really sort of old 17th century fortress. And they had quite a lot of space. They had lots of books. They would garden. They were very keen on sort of making a beautiful garden together and this kind of thing. But they didn't know, for instance, the information about the famine and what was going on outside. They were quite cut off from. They didn't have a radio. They'd get newspapers, but sort of out of date. And they weren't able to meet Gandhi or to really talk about things between themselves. So they were very frustrated by that being cut off politically. But they weren't treated in a harsh way. I mean, the Andamans prison that I showed and that place, that was far more kind of hostile kind of environment to be imprisoned in. And I think, like a lot of things in India, I mean, caste and class made the difference. So, your average kind of offender who might have been locked up in a local jail could have had a very different sort of experience to Nehru, who was certainly treated very well.
What about the Anglo-Indians?
Oh yes,
They tend to sort of support the Raj because they were worried.
Yeah, exactly.
Likely.
They were very supportive of the Raj. In fact, a lot of nurses were Anglo-Indian. There were a lot of Anglo-Indian nurses, and also the railways. Those civil railways where the Anglo-Indians had tended to work. Then they became involved in helping with sort of stocks and supplies and the military demands on the railways. So the Anglo-Indians were quite sort of disproportionately important group because, as you say, I mean, their loyalty questions were less sort of unclear. They were very clearly wanted the Raj to stay in place, often because they felt that they wouldn't be protected under a national government, and so they were very much. But some of them felt quite sort of let down then at independence, because their own citizenship and their own status is quite unclear, and some of them were able, of course, to move to Britain, but not all of them.
Unless they married a British soldier.
Yeah, yes, which many did. I mean, those, and that's another theme that runs through. In American soldiers weren't allowed to marry them. They were banned from marrying locally. So that's the British ones were able to, but American ones didn't. It didn't, and that creates quite a few in specific problems that are. People are writing letters and complaining about this, and
the role of Indian troops in the war in the West? Were any brought to fight on the Western Front or North Africa?
Yes, they were. In North Africa in particular, very, very prominent role in North Africa and Tobruk, Battle of Keren, East Africa, around Eritrea, and Iraq. They were there in Monte Cassino. They were there in Italy in the recapture of Italy. They played a very important part. There were even few Indians flying planes in the Battle of Britain, in the RAF. So they're there everywhere in the West. Sometimes in sort of smaller numbers, but sometimes really in significant numbers, particularly in North and East Africa, and then later in Burma and in Southeast Asia as well. Greece as well. A lot of Indians in Greece and in Sicily too.
What about the role of those who saw who wanted to go through alliance with Nazi Germany?
Yes, I haven't talked about them. Part of the reason I haven't talked about them is because there is a lot more sort of known about them. But just to talk about that, there is the creation through Bose, Subhash Chandra Bose, who breaks with Gandhi and with the Indian National Congress, and he goes really to the extreme of saying we should go and find support from the Germans and the Japanese in order to create a renegade breakaway army, and he creates the Indian National Army, which is a force which fights with the Japanese in Southeast Asia. Now Bose, I think, he's a fascinating figure in himself, because he goes on the run and goes overland and goes to Germany, but he does meet with Himmler and with Hitler, and his position, I think, is really untenable. Even if he then later kind of can claim that he didn't agree with fascism or with what the Axis were doing, he certainly kind of takes that side. Now, what happens at the end of the war is Bose dies mysteriously in a plane crash, just as Zia al-Haq had died mysteriously in a plane crash, and he's kind of feted and celebrated. Today the airport in Calcutta is the Bose, Subhash Chandra Bose Airport, but a lot of that is politics rather than, it's about the celebration of of somebody who's seen to be standing up to the British at the end of the war. So it's in 1945, 1946, 1947, as that momentum for independence builds, Bose is celebrated and is brought into the picture. Then, in real terms, the INA was quite small, and it was made up of a lot of prisoners of war and local civilians in Southeast Asia who were kind of caught in the middle and put into the INA, and it wasn't a very effective fighting force, but it is an interesting aspect.
I think a lot of them were captured at Singapore, weren't they?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
When you talk of Anglo-Indians worried about their future and not being able to marry Americans, are you talking about mixed race or basically British families who spent sometimes 1 or 2 generations in India?
That's interesting, because the word Anglo-Indian has 2 meanings in the history of South Asia. It can mean the sort of British in India, the sort of as the administrators, but I suppose I was using it, and the question was relating to mixed race families that dated back to the time. Those of you who've seen William Dalrymple's documentaries and the idea of those sort of mixed families, those descendants of those mixed families continued right into the 20th century and continue to live in India into the 20th century, but their status often dropped considerably, and they no longer had that link to the British ruling class. They were living in kind of communities themselves, often as Christians, often as Christian converts. So that's the when that word Anglo-Indian, I think, relates to that community. I think probably we should wrap it up there at 15:15. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you.
Box to sell. Was it reabsorbed back in the interregnum before partition, or was it effectively partitioned?
Well, it's they have to kind of supporting the national it's kind of in this kind of messy right from that time on, which continues until partition. Yeah.
What you say about the first, the chap who produced the first steam ships, in the Avatar First Books, I thought one of his characters there started building steamships.
I should go back to that, because I've read two copies. I should go back and have a look at that.
I think, that it was a shipbuilding family,
Maybe it's
they were there, and one of them I thought,
I'll go back and read about that.
Yeah.
I mean,